All right, good morning, folks. Happy top of the hour to you. It's Thursday and what looks like to be a very beautiful day in the state. Supposed to be getting into 80 here in the Treasure Valley, which is pretty crazy. But let's get rocking here. So we've got a pretty packed agenda for you today. As usual, we start with our celebrations and our shout outs. We'll recap quickly some of February's inventory discussion. We'll look at the data acquisition calendar before looking at some housekeeping. We've got a couple items in housekeeping today. We've got, of course, some upcoming grant and personal development opportunities. We've got some ESEA and federal programs updates and some special education updates before we jump into the hot topics, which are primarily some updates from the state side, mostly looking at the state budget, some questions we have there, and also some legislation updates before finally capping it off with some professional development in 30. And Brian Ferguson is going to be joining us to talk about some fraud detection and prevention. So first, celebrations and shout outs. So Centrally High School's cheerleaders had some big national title wins in Las Vegas recently. So congratulations to them. I think they had back-to-back wins, including some wins last year. And then also, since it's March Madness season, happy retirement to Mountain View High School's Jeff Nettleton after 31 years as a basketball coach. And lastly, we have 82 students who were named candidates for the U.S. Presidential Scholars Program. So quite a few students throughout the entire state, and we're rooting them on that they might be able to continue on in that particular program. So recapping inventory, we've got a link to the full documentation, the whole PowerPoint and the recording from last month. So since we've got quite a bit going on, I'll just give you kind of the high level review in case you missed it. So first talking about capital assets. What are capital assets? So these are going to be your tangible or your intangible assets that have a useful life more than 1 year and are going to be capitalized in accordance with GAAP. So that includes your land, your vehicles, buildings, even things you lease, whether that's a car or a building that you're leasing under GASB 87. So those are all things that we're going to consider a capital asset. Now that does include any alterations that you're making or improvements you're making to that underlying asset. So again, if you're putting a new ramp in to make accessibility for students who are on a wheelchair, that would improve the underlying asset and improve that asset, and then we'd have to track on that. But that doesn't include your repair. So when you're repainting things or looking at replacing some items like your fuel filters or excuse me, your oil filters on a car, those are things we're not going to worry about necessarily counting into that underlying asset since it's a maintenance item. And this does not include necessarily those intangible right to use assets or your right to use operating lease assets. So there are some differences in there. Next, equipment. So this is going to be that tangible property that you're actually interacting with. And that does include your IT systems, since those are pretty expensive to be building and maintaining. So those again still have that useful life of more than 1 year, and it equals or exceeds the lesser of evil, either the capitalization threshold that you all have set internally, or $10,000, whichever is the smallest. Next, some notes on the state procurement thresholds. Now, again, these look a little bit different than what you might see on the federal side because there's no micro purchases. On the state side, we just call that a small purchase. So that's going to be your services less than $25,000 or in general goods that are less than $15,000. Then once we get past that threshold, we would go into some of those higher ranges. So most of those small purchases, you have a fairly nominal hurdle to go over. Once we start getting above that $15,000 or $25,000 and you start going into the informal purchase territory, that's where you need to have the three bids to make sure that you're in compliance with the state statute there. Then we're going pretty much from that $25,000 or $15,000 up to 150. That's where your three bid requirements are. Anything over that 150, you're doing a full-on RFP and you're doing some sealed procedures. So that's a little bit more work, a little bit more upfront, more planning. It's going to take you a little bit more time. Another item here. When it comes to the FAR on micro purchases, that is $15,000. However, that may have some other things that come with that. So you might think, hey, it's below 15, we're good. You may have to pump the brakes a little bit because internally, a lot of our grants have a $10,000 threshold for capital expenditures that requires some written approval from us. So when you're in doubt on that, please reach out to the folks who are working on your grants so we can make sure that everything is proper, it's authorized, and you're in good shape. Next, the capitalization threshold. So that's how you're tracking things. That capitalization threshold is going to be something that each ELEA is going to be responsible for setting up themselves. So again, you could set it all the way up at $10,000. You probably won't have that many assets that are hitting that capitalization threshold. But you can also pull that down to 500 if you really wanted to and really track all those assets individually. Really is up to you all on what works best for your business practices. But that 10,000 threshold is pretty key because that is going to be one of your limits. Next, on inventory. So what do we do with these assets? How do we track them? We recommend that you have a combination of those items that are required in CFR and also some of the state requirements. One of the first items is that physical inventory must be reconciled. The feds say by every 2 years, the state says annually. So in that case, since it's more restrictive on the state side, you should be doing that annually. Then you also want to make sure you have your internal controls to prevent theft, damage, or loss, that you are doing your proper maintenance. And then when it comes to actually tracking those inventory in a spreadsheet or a software system, we want to make sure you have the serial number, the source of funding, what it was bought with, who's holding the title of that item, when you bought it, the initial cost of that property, so we can work on the depreciation side of it. What percentage of it was paid with federal funds, if any? Maybe you're using almost all of your federal funds to work through really your payroll and some of your operating, you're not spending a whole lot on assets. Still helpful to have that field available. So in the future, if we do have some sort of new ESSER type funding that comes on board, you can say, hey, half of this was bought, half this vehicle was bought with federal funds. We need to be able to track that and monitor that for later needs. Then you also want to have the location and the use of property be available. So those are some items we recommend is pretty helpful as far as tracking that inventory and making sure you have a good idea of what's going on within that. I'm going to pause here real quick. It looks like we got some chats, and it's all of our AI friends that are helping us take notes. We do appreciate AI these days. Next, the surplus assets. And this is one of the spots where I recommended we have that purchase date, the purchase price, and how much was spent with federal funds. Because when it comes to disposing of that asset, you do have to know, hey, if this is 100% federal funds and I'm getting over maybe $15,000 for it, there could be a federal fund implication there. The feds want to make sure that when it comes to their assets, when they're being disposed, that some cut comes back to the feds often. So when it comes to actually selling the items, the preference is to be able to sell it to another state, local, or federal entity. And you can do that without advertisement. Those things can be done pretty directly because they are public entities. After that, you can sell it at a public auction after advertising it for at least 2 weeks. And again, that's a state requirement. You can also transfer it to another entity, including our 501c3s or our 501c19s, which are veteran organizations, before recycling it or just throwing it away. So sometimes we have some items that truly are not really going to be useful after their life. They've been really hit hard. Sometimes those things just got to be recycled or disposed of. Next, what is on your radar? We've got quite a bit of data coming in on our data acquisition calendar. So starting tomorrow, we've got the IC for our McKinney-Vento student data collection coming in. And then also tomorrow, another big one, the IC submission for March. So that data submission is pretty key going into our public school finance folks. And these are the data points we're going to be using building out some of the next disbursements. We've also got corrections due for your May 15th foundation payment. So if you find some issues, some kids were missing on your some of your reporting, those corrections are going to be due on the 27th. And then next, moving on to April, there are again quite a few items coming in. So if you're looking at doing your community eligibility provision and your direct certification, you're going to want to be running those reports at the beginning of April, so we have those handy. Also down at the bottom, on the end of April, we've got to notify your county clerks of your budget hearings. When are those budgets going to be, and or excuse me, when are they going to be held? And so that way they have those on hand. And lastly, at the very bottom, the IC financial transparency upload for April. This is going to be your third submission of those cumulative data points that are going out to the board. Next, some housekeeping. So we've kind of put in here some interesting education opportunities. There wasn't a whole lot of grants available, so most of this is going to be focused on kind of fun things or items that are going to be fun for your kids in the schools here. The first one's a school bus safety poster contest. It's a pretty neat little poster that the kids can put in the flyer and put that in and have an award potentially for that. Now, those are due by April 17th. The next item is from the U.S. Air Force, and they have a STEM to Sky presentations throughout the state on May 4th and 22nd. So you can register there, see where they're going to be, and what times those are at. Another little plug-in for our friends up in North Idaho. They're trying to really read a million pages contest between March 15th and the end of August. So that's a pretty neat program if you're in the northern part of the state. I highly encourage your students to try to take a look at getting into that and see how many pages can get read. The Science Pathways program is going to be due May 1st. And lastly, on this page, the Idaho Mathematics Project for Achievement Coaching and Teaching registration is due by the end of the month. Now, as far as some professional development, on April 24th in Idaho Falls, in Boise on May 29th, and virtually on June 12th is the Driver Education Conference. And so if you're involved in the driver education program, that's a great spot to be able to learn some more about that and what is available. The next item is the National Science Teaching Association National Conference, which is going to be held April 15th through the 18th. We've also got the Brave Institute, which is going to be helping work on those critical conversations, especially for those who are in leadership, and applications for that are due May 4th. We've also got that summer internship, or excuse me, summer externship program for our grades 6 through 12 educators with this STEM Action Center. That's a pretty neat program that allows teachers to go out into the field, work with both private industry and nonprofits to be able to work as an extern during the summertime. And lastly, Pro Ethica has some free ethics training that's available for superintendents and administrators. Next, I'm going to hand this on over then to Austin. Austin, why don't you go ahead and take the reins, partner?
Morning, folks. Just a quick heads up: the GRA manual that was in the GRA and on the State Department of Education website has now been updated. So if you want to wander into the GRA itself, under the documentation tab, there's an item there that says user manual. You'll want to open that up. It has a bunch of information about how to navigate the GRA like it used to, and how to troubleshoot some small items, in addition to some new guidance for federal programs and special education drawdown requests, including what supporting documentation ought to look like, what food cost requirements there are, what we need to see when you're submitting for a claim for salaries and benefits, that sort of thing. So it's kind of a complete revamp of the manual with a really hard look at what GRA claims ought to look like when you're reimbursing funds for federal programs and SPED in general. So give that a look. There's some new requirements in there. I highly recommend giving it a look before July 1, as the requirements within the manual will take effect on that date. So we'll be doing our best to circulate some guidance and circulate some extra trainings. I imagine we'll have a section in the future communities of practice where we go through some of the broader changes. So just stay posted for that. But the manual is already published if you wanted to open it up and give it a look through. So, broader federal programs department updates. First and foremost, CFSGA workshops are coming. We will have a section in Boise on April 28th, in Pocatello on the 6th of May, in Coeur d'Alene on May 13th. Memory serves, we're going to be back at ISU in Pocatello, and I believe we're at the Hospice Center of Idaho up in Coeur d'Alene. Boise, I can't remember offhand, but I know it's going to be nearby to the State Department itself. So feel free to drop by, ask us questions, hear updates about the CFSGA. We'll be publishing a new CFSGA manual shortly before the beginning of these sessions, so you'll have an opportunity to have a look at what all is new. But there are some pretty good shifts and pretty good adjustments being made in the CFSGA this year. Also, a quick note, we already have our allocations for the year. So with the submission of a couple more data points that are on the data collection calendar, we'll be able to get the CFSGA updated and actually out to the LEAs. You'll be able to see what your allocations are here in the next month or so, most certainly before the beginning of the workshop. So there is a reality where you get your CFSGA, you open it up, and you start working through it as best you can. And if you run into any touch points or weird items that you're not familiar with, you drop by the workshops and we work through it with you. So with that being said, next item, like I just mentioned, allocations are here. For the programs that we have received, is either been an increase or it's been steady funded. Good to see. I know there was some concern in the past, year or so about Migrant 1C and 3A specifically, but they are here and they are increased and funded for the state of Idaho. Now, of course, there's always the caveat that just because the state's allocation has gone up or stayed the same does not mean that individual LEAs haven't had some other student population change that affects their allocation separately. But this is kind of broadly good news for the state in general. 1D and 1D subpart 1 and 5B for those rural districts who don't take SRSA funding, those allocations are still kind of pending. We'll get a view on those much closer to July 1. So we'll have those out before too terribly long. And then finally, just reiterating, new GRA manual is live. We got a link to the manual in the slide deck itself. New standards are in effect on July 1. This has been a passion project for a few of us in the department, so looking forward to getting your feedback and leveraging some fantastic volunteer efforts from some business managers in the state. So this is a great thing to download and send to your business manager or send to the folks that are responsible for your GRA claims, and it's got some help in the CFSGA as well. So with that, I'll pass it back off to Rob. Thank you, folks. Good morning.
Thanks, Austin. A lot of work on the GRA manual. Very much appreciate it. Both folks in the department who've been working on that and also folks who have volunteered their time out in the LEAs to help give us some good screenshots, best practices for how they're using data and reporting especially. So next, we'll hand it off to Lisa.
All right, good morning, everybody. I just have a couple special ed updates. Next slide, please. Similar to Austin, I don't quite have allocations done, but I'll talk about that here. We have a little bit different process for the IDEA special education funding for those federal grants. So we as a state have to apply annually. There's an application process where we are open for public comment, and we have to have our application for the whole grant package posted for 60 days. And again, once we get all the public comment and take that into consideration, we can adjust that final budget ask to the feds in order to qualify for that state funding. We have to send out an announcement, so we will be doing that most likely tomorrow. So if you're a business manager, superintendent, or a special education director, a partner agency, a parent advisory group, just about anybody we can find, we send it out for transparency. There's no action required, but it will have the links in case you want to give any comments about better investments or things that you have questions on so that we can take those into consideration. But we do not have any allocations to the state yet. While we know what the federal numbers are, it indicates it's going to be fairly flat. It looks overall like there's a small increase to special education programs as a whole for all 50 states, but we're being told to be expecting about the same amount. So what that means for you guys is that if your populations haven't changed much, just as Austin had indicated, then you that can help you ballpark what your allocation is going to be. But again, only ballpark, because if other districts are seeing a growth, it kind of almost makes yours feel smaller. And so best thing I can tell you about IDEA funding is that 85% of your allocation as an LEA is really based on your total enrollment, and the other 15% is based off of low income ratios. So that's the main part. There's a tiny little base funding, but that's the best way I can tell you to estimate. I know it always seems lame that we say something like just budget flat, but that's the best we can do to get you in process, I would say, so that you can start getting those numbers in, because I know those budgets, like Rob mentioned, you got to get those notifications to be able to say, hey, we're going to present our budget coming up in our May meeting. So with that, we'll get out those allocations hopefully in April, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, now we're moving to some state items. I like to kind of laugh internally because whenever March Madness happens, it seems like the legislature starts really moving into things. You're going to see a lot of interesting, brilliant, crazy ideas come out of the legislature, and it's really fast paced as they try to wrap up. So we seen our current year public schools budget remain more or less untouched by JFAC. It went in pretty much just as was requested, so not a lot of surprises there. As far as our maintenance budget. And a bit of a reminder, so this year we have three budget bills, our maintenance budget, a rescission budget, and then enhancement budgets. And so the rescission budget didn't hit public schools at this point. So we're grateful for that. No current year adjustments coming down that you're going to have to figure out how to scramble for the last minute. But we haven't had our enhancement budget set yet. So it was supposed to be set 10 days ago, but because of changes coming in, especially with IDLA and not sure how to do that yet, there's quite a few bills which we'll get to here in a minute as far as addressing IDLA. But they have not set our enhancement budgets yet. So we still don't really know what fiscal year 27 is looking like in total. That said, we are very anxious to see if that's going to come up potentially tomorrow or early next week is our hope. Our department budget did get set. We did have our enhancements come through. There was not the increase we were hoping for some of our stop arm grants for bus safety. We did get that in fiscal year 27, so we will see those grants continue at about $30,000 a year. We did also have a 4% general fund rescission for the current fiscal year and a 5% rescission. The only reason I mention this is because there were some adjustments that were being made. We tried our best to limit those to being things like some of the advanced opportunities payments that we give out to non-public school students to try to minimize the impact on our public school side. And also we tried to keep as many of our staff in as possible. So we didn't see any hits to our staffing ratios at this point to make sure we can continue to provide the services you all are needing. So at this point, we took those hits. We're moving forward. We don't expect to see a large amount of diminishing services to you all out in the field. Next, I've got two slides of bills of interest and then a slide looking at bills that have already been signed into law. So the top one, Senate Bill 1288, is our high needs student fund, and that is again for the special education students that are costing over $30,000 a year. It passed the Senate and is awaiting a hearing in the House Education Committee. We're hoping that'll come out soon. Next item is our public schools maintenance budget. I already kind of mentioned that a little bit. Still no votes on the enhancements yet. And then Senate Bill 1339 is an interesting one. This is a strategic performance plan that replaces your current continuous improvement plans. Another item that's interesting about that bill in particular is it would remove some of the mandatory reporting that we see on most things that don't include a federal grant or public school finance. Next, excuse me, House Bill 599 removed that first come, first serve language provision from the digital content and curriculum funding. That went out in 3 minutes last year, so pretty quick, and we want to move that instead to a more of an application-based process. Let's see, House Bill 711 is going to be the alternative authorizations for your administrators. And then there are also a couple other items in here just to look at. I won't hit all of them. Next, there is House Bill 831, which changes how schools can be used as a polling place, especially not being on a day that there is instruction. And then we've got two bills, and this is kind of proof of the March Madness that I was referring to earlier. Two different ways of approaching IDLA funding. Some of the House Bill 918 is from Representative Pickett, who's in leadership. And that would be quite a bit different than the one above it, still limiting some of the funding that are going to IDLA. But House Bill 918 does also limit some administrative costs and removes full virtual school funding, driver's ed, or K-5 education from IDLA. So those are going to be things that are going to adjust how you might use those depending on what utilization you're using in IDLA. Again, neither of these have gone through, so we're really kind of seeing what's going to stick. House Bill 832 loosened up some of the authorizations for your CTE instructors so that they can have kind of a different way of getting that certification. Another item that was rather interesting is Senate Concurrent Resolution 121, which directed the department to design a new funding formula that can modernize how we're paying all of you for the services you're providing to students. So this is going to be a heavy lift. We're gearing up for getting going on it. Even if honestly that concurrent resolution doesn't go through the House, we're still looking to see what can we do to modernize this funding formula since it is very, very old at this point and it's not really tracking with the students you're trying to teach. Another couple items that have already been signed into law by the governor. The first one is mandatory reporting to parents of both the alleged victim and the alleged perpetrator of a bullying incident if a suspension occurs. There have also been some changes to virtual education funding, including removing those supplemental learning funds that were paid directly to parents through House Bill 624. And lastly, we added through they added through House Bill 636 some allowances if you have all of your bonds and levies paid off. At the very bottom of that waterfall of uses for the school district facilities funds is the capacity to start some lease purchase agreements with those funds. So kind of broadening out how some of those funds might be made available for schools who are already debt free or moving towards being debt free. Next, I'm going to hand this one over to Brian, and we're going to do some fraud detection and prevention. Go ahead and take it away there, Brian.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Ferguson. I'm a financial specialist here with the Department of Education. And if we could go to the next slide. Oh,
Sorry.
all good. So what is fraud? In a broad sense, fraud encompasses any crime for gain that uses deception as its principal modus operandi. More specifically, Black's Law Dictionary defines fraud as a knowing misrepresentation of the truth or concealment of a material fact to induce another to act to his or her detriment. Consequently, fraud includes any intentional or deliberate act to deprive another of property or money by guile, deception, or other unfair means. Under U.S. common law, four general elements must be present for a fraud to exist. A material false statement has to be made, knowledge that the statement was false when it was uttered, the reliance on the false statement by the victim, and finally, damages resulting from the victim's reliance on the false statement. Next slide. Okay. There are normally fraud involves three steps: the act, the concealment, and the conversion. To perpetrate successful frauds, offenders must complete all three steps. They must commit the act, conceal the act, and then convert the proceeds for personal benefit. The act is normally theft or deception, an action that causes the perpetrator's desired gain. Concealment is once the perpetrator has committed that fraud act, they must then make efforts to conceal it. For example, in the case of a theft of cash, falsifying the balance in the cash account would constitute concealment. Once the act is completed and concealed, the perpetrator must convert their ill-gotten gains for their own benefit. In the case of the theft of petty cash, conversion occurs when the perpetrator deposits the funds into their own account or makes purchases with their stolen funds. That being said, there's kind of an overlap between errors and fraud. But generally, when auditing, we look for irregularities, whether they're caused by fraud or error. Many auditors take a similar approach to detecting and responding to both types of irregularities. However, the inherent nature of fraud, specifically that it's intentionally concealed, means that the audit tests designed to uncover errors are often insufficient to catch calculated financial manipulations. Next slide. There are two types of fraud. There's internal and external. External fraud is against a company, covers a broad range of schemes. Dishonest vendors might engage in bid-rigging schemes, bill the company for goods or services not provided, or demand bribes from employees. Likewise, dishonest customers might submit bad checks or falsified account information for payment, or might attempt to return stolen or knockoff products for a refund. Additionally, organizations face threats of security breaches and thefts of intellectual property perpetrated by unknown third parties. Internal fraud is also called occupational fraud, which is defined as the use of one's occupation for personal enrichment through the deliberate misuse or misapplication of the organization's resources or assets. Simply stated, occupational fraud and abuse occurs when an employee, manager, or executive commits fraud against their employer. Occupational fraud is roughly synonymous with terms like employee fraud or embezzlement. However, occupational fraud and abuse is broader and better reflects the full range of employee misconduct through which organizations lose money. Next slide, please. So now we're going to shift into some common schemes that are seen with fraud. The first is corruption, and it involves an employee's use of influence in business transactions in a way that violates their duty to the employer for the purpose of obtaining a benefit for themselves or somebody else. These schemes create an unhealthy situation for business. In the ACFE's 2024 report to the nations, the median loss for the corruption cases covered in the study was $200,000. There are several types of corruption schemes that are common, such as bribery and kickbacks, illegal gratuities, economic extortion, and conflicts of interest. Now, because corruption the active participation of an outside party in the fraud. Typical auditing procedures might fall short in identifying the occurrence of this type of fraud. In fact, most corruption schemes are detected through tips from honest and disgruntled coworkers or vendors. These allegations can be evaluated through analysis of the red flags associated with suspect people or transactions, which we will cover a little bit later. Next slide, please. So there is financial statement fraud. It generally isn't going to be as pertinent, but it's going to be the overstatement of assets, understatement of liabilities, and then improper disclosures. So covering improper disclosures, since that's a little bit more relevant to us, the common schemes include related party transactions, not stating what related parties are, liability omissions, fraudulent information regarding significant events or covering up significant events, management fraud, and accounting changes, without mentioning that there has been an accounting change. Next slide, please. Pretty common as well are asset misappropriation schemes. These include both theft of the company assets, such as cash or inventory, and the misuse of company assets, such as using a company car for a personal trip. Asset misappropriation schemes are generally cash or inventory based. Cash, you've got theft of cash on hand, theft of cash receipts, and fictitious disbursements. Well, inventory and all other assets, you have misuse and larceny. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered some schemes, what are the actual costs of fraud? The reach of fraud extends well beyond the actual dollar amount stolen or the financial statement manipulation. In the wake of a fraud, employees might lose confidence in their job security, leading to decreased productivity. Moreover, the company's image is tarnished, decreasing its reputation in the eyes of existing and potential customers and vendors. In some instances, competitors have used reports of fraud as a recruiting advantage in attracting the top talent. Next slide, please. So why do people commit fraud? People generally perpetrate fraud for one or more of the following reasons: to obtain money, property, or services, to avoid payment or loss of services, or to secure personal or business advantage. However, most people who commit fraud against their employers are not career criminals. Most are trusted employees who have no criminal history and do not consider themselves as lawbreakers. So the question is, what causes these otherwise law-abiding individuals to commit fraud? Here we introduce the fraud triangle. The best and most widely accepted model for explaining why people commit fraud is the fraud triangle. Dr. Donald Cressy, a criminologist whose research focused on embezzlers, developed this model. According to Cressy, 3 factors must be present at the same time in order for an ordinary person to commit fraud. First, there must be pressure, then there must be perceived opportunity, and finally, rationalization for the fraud. The first leg of the fraud triangle represents pressure. This is what motivates the crime in the first place. The individuals might have a financial problem that they are unable to solve through legitimate means, so they begin to consider committing an illegal act, such as stealing cash or falsifying a financial statement. The pressure can be personal, i.e., they are too deep in personal debt, or professional, their job or business is in jeopardy. Examples of pressure that commonly lead to fraud include inability to pay one's bills, drug or gambling addictions, need to meet earnings to sustain investor confidence, need to meet productivity targets at work, and desire for status symbols such as a bigger house or nicer car. The second leg of the fraud triangle is opportunity, also referred to as perceived opportunity, which defines the method by which the crime can be committed. These perpetrators must see a way to use or abuse their position of trust to solve a financial problem without detection. It's critical that the fraud perpetrators solve their problems in secret. Many people commit financial crimes to maintain their social status. For instance, they might steal to conceal a drug problem, pay off debts, or acquire expensive cars or houses. If a perpetrator is caught embezzling or falsifying financial information, it can hurt their status at least as much as the underlying problem they were trying to conceal. So the fraudster not only has to be able to steal funds, but they must be able to do it and avoid detection at the same time. The third leg of the fraud triangle is rationalization. As previously mentioned, most fraudsters are first-time offenders with no criminal past. They do not view themselves as criminals. They see themselves as ordinary, honest people caught in a bad situation of circumstances. Consequently, fraudsters must justify crimes to themselves in ways that make it acceptable or justifiable. This rationalization, that is rationalization. Common rationalizations include: I was only borrowing the money, I was entitled to the money, I had to steal to provide for my family, I was underpaid, my employer cheated me, or my employer is dishonest to others and deserved to be defrauded. Next slide, please. Frauds typically come with symptoms that can alert auditors or other employees to the crime. Warning signs relating to potential fraud can be broken down into several categories, including accounting anomalies, internal control weaknesses, analytical anomalies, operational anomalies, and behavioral anomalies. Auditors should remember that the mere presence of these red flags does not necessarily indicate fraud. However, if an auditor identifies one or more of these during an engagement, they should take note of it, consider other audit findings with the red flag in mind, and determine whether it meets additional examination. Accounting anomalies are unusual deviations from standard accounting practices, such as missing documents, stale items on reconciliations, alterations of documents, etc. Internal control weaknesses can serve as red flags, and common red flags are lack of separation of duties, lack of physical safeguards, lack of independent checks, lack of proper authorization on documents, override of existing controls, and inadequate accounting systems. Analytical anomalies are relationships, procedures, or events that do not make sense, either common or business, or that seem unreasonable. These include transactions that happen at odd times or places, transactions that involve people who would not normally be part of the event, transactions that involve amounts that are too small or too big, and transactions that occur too often or too rarely. Examples of analytical anomalies include increase in inventory purchasing during a period of declining sales, company assets sold under market value, excessive number of checking accounts, frequent changes in banking accounts, significant downsizing in a healthy market, unexpected overdrafts or decline in cash balances, unexplained changes in certain ratios that are expected to remain stable over time, anomalies arising from the application of data mining techniques. Operational anomalies are unusual events concerning the company's operations. Such circumstances might or might not be within the control of management, but they do merit consideration as red flags for possible fraud. Some of these anomalies are operating on a crisis basis, insufficient capital, dependence on one or two products, frequent changes in legal counsel, frequent changes in executive management and directors, high employee turnover, especially in areas that are more vulnerable to fraud, continuous rollover of loans, a compensation program that is out of proportion to its profits, unusual organization structure, severe obsolescence of assets, and problems with government regulators. Finally, fraud perpetrators often display behaviors or characteristics that might indicate they have a heightened risk for committing fraud. On their own, these behavioral red flags do not prove an individual is engaged in fraud, but they should raise warning signals to the individual's coworkers, staff, as well as the organization's anti-fraud staff. Next slide, please. Okay. Ratio analysis is the means of measuring the relationship between two different amounts. The relationship and comparison are the keys to the analysis. Ratio analysis can be helpful in detecting potential errors and other irregularities with respect to various balance sheet and income statement items. Ratios that have a predictable pattern, i.e. they tend to be either stable over time or they exhibit an upward or downward trend, are the most reliable ratios for fraud detection. The accounts receivable turnover can be useful in detecting revenue manipulation. The ratio is calculated as follows: net sales divided by your average accounts receivable. Generally, this ratio remains steady as sales volume increases or decreases, absent other changes that could affect the ratio, such as granting of credit or changes in collection policies. If a company is recording fictitious sales, the effect of this ratio varies depending on where in the balance sheet the overstated sales appear. If the overstatement in sales is accompanied by an offsetting overstatement in accounts receivable, both the numerator and denominator of the receivables turnover ratio are increased by equal amounts. But since the numerator is or the sales is normally a much larger figure than the denominator, the effect of the turnover ratio is to decrease it as fictitious sales are recorded. If fictitious sales are recorded elsewhere in the balance sheet, such as by increasing property and equipment or inappropriately decreasing deferred revenue, the effect is to lower the ratio. Sales to total asset ratio is one of the more reliable indicators of fraud. This ratio is calculated as follows: net sales divided by average total assets. A sudden or continuing decrease in this ratio is often associated with improper capitalization of expenses, which increases the denominator without a corresponding increase to the numerator. The asset turnover ratio is also useful for detecting failures to write off assets, such as uncollectible accounts receivable or obsolete inventory, or failures to record impairment losses on property or intangible assets. Other ratios to analyze include leverage ratios and working capital to total assets ratios. Those can be used to help investigate fraud. Next, I was going to cover one of my favorite tools for analysis, and this is Benford's law. In 1938, Frank Benford did a study of numbers and found that certain numbers and number combinations appeared more frequently than others. After analyzing more than 20,000 pieces of data, he found that the chance that the first digit in the data being 1 is not 1 in 9, but rather 1 in 3, or 30%. The chance that the first number in the string will be 2 is 17%, and the probability that successive numbers will be the first digit decline until reaching 9, which has only a 5% chance of occurring. In other words, he found that when there are tables of numbers, the digit 1 occurs more often than any of the other numbers. Further research of Benford's law found that it's possible to detect fraudulent numbers in large data files by comparing the frequency of the appearance of initial digits in a list of numbers to those anticipated by Benford. For example, when embezzlers invent numbers, they tend to fake data containing too many initial digits of 7, 8, or 9, and too few instances of 1, 2, and 3. Benford's law is depicted here on the screen. This is what the curve looks like, and it's defined by the equation PD equals the natural log of 1 plus 1 over d, where d is the digit that occurs. All right, next slide, please. So one of the most important aspects of any fraud examination is to actively seek ways to prevent fraud. Often, resources are focused on detecting and investigating the fraud when the real emphasis should be placed on preventing it from happening in the first place. In the long run, preventing fraud is more cost-effective. Internal control plays an important role in fraud prevention. Although a system of weak internal controls does not mean that fraud exists, it does foster an environment for fraud to succeed. Conversely, having strong internal controls does not preclude fraud from occurring. It is for these reasons that the auditors should understand the effect internal control has on an organization. Common internal control weaknesses that might lead to fraud include lack of separation of duties, lack of physical safeguards, lack of independent reviews, lack of proper authorizations on documents and records, override of existing controls, and an inadequate accounting system. Increasing the perception of detection might very well be the most effective fraud prevention method. Internal controls, for example, do little good in forestalling theft and fraud in their presence, or if their presence is not known by those at risk. Among the audit profession, this means letting employees, managers, and executives know that auditors are actively seeking out information concerning internal theft. This can be accomplished via employee education, management oversight, clear punishment for illegal acts, and well-defined reporting avenues. Employees should know how and where to report suspicious, unethical, or illegal behavior. The pressures faced by employees can be especially difficult to detect. However, proactively aiding employees who are under personal pressure might help to deter fraudulent conduct. Companies can take steps to assist an employee who might be having difficult times. Open door policies, employee support systems, and an understanding management climate all contribute to alleviating employee pressures, which in turn minimize your fraud risk. All right, next slide. Okay, so fraud and abuse allegations. Did you know about forensic audits to investigate the potential misuse of public funds? The investigation services within the Education Office of Inspector General investigates alleged criminal and civil wrongdoing by entities and individuals involving education funds and programs. Each year, unscrupulous people steal or intentionally misuse education funds, federal student aid, special education money, or Title I funds to school districts with low-income families. They intentionally abuse education programs, unlawfully access education computer systems and databases, or use education funding to support terrorism. Next slide, please. So, based on the False Claims Act, an applicant, recipient, or subrecipient of a federal award must promptly disclose whenever, in connection with the federal award, it has credible evidence of the commission or of a violation of federal criminal law involving fraud, conflict of interest, bribery, or gratuity violations found in Title 18 of the United States Code or violation of the Civil False Claims Act. The disclosure must be made in writing to the federal agency, the agency's Office of Inspector General, and pass-through entity, if applicable. And there is the relevant citation. Next slide, please. Under 2 CFR 200.113, districts must promptly disclose in writing whenever they have credible evidence of certain violations related to a federal award. These are three non-negotiables. Prompt, you do not wait for a full investigation. It must be written, not informal, not verbal. And you must have credible evidence. This is not a suspicion, and this isn't necessarily proof. This is evidence of the crime, and you will present those to the Inspector General. If a reasonable person would take concern seriously based on the facts you have, you've crossed into mandatory disclosure territory, and you should probably report. Next slide. So a core requirement under Uniform Grant Guidance is credible evidence. A district must promptly disclose in writing if it has credible evidence of certain violations tied to federal award. Disclosures go to the federal agency, the Office of the Inspector General, and the state pass-through entity. Reporting shows you are compliant, not that you're guilty, right? If you suspect that there's fraud, you report it, and that's what you're supposed to do. That's you staying in your lane and doing exactly what we've set out with the False Claims Act and the other 2 CFR 200.113. Next slide. So why is there a shift in credible evidence standard for those of you that are familiar with old policies? The old mindset is we report when we know a violation happened. The new reality is you must report when you have credible evidence, not just proof. So when you suspect that something's going on and you've got some evidence, like those red flags are popping up, that's when you report. We've lowered the threshold for reporting, and you do not need to prove that the violation occurred. That is the purpose of the investigation that will happen afterwards. You do not wait until you're sure. It's a responsibility to report when evidence becomes credible. Next slide, please. So why did we lower the threshold? The intent behind the change is to prevent entities from waiting too long to report. If you wait too long, then it's going to be more difficult to prove that the fraud happened. And then avoid situations where problems are hidden and investigations drag on internally. We want to try and shorten that time frame and investigate and prosecute as soon as possible. Additionally, we want to increase early visibility for federal oversight. Next slide. And with that, I conclude my presentation on fraud. Do we have any questions?
Doesn't look like anything's popping up in the chat yet. Thank you very much, Brian. Fraud's a scary thing. It happens, unfortunately, all the time. It can happen in ways you don't expect. So really appreciate the information, especially some of that information on the occurrence of numbers. It's a really fascinating thing to me that we're far more likely to have ones as far as digits in our analysis, in our data sets than anything else. So thank you all very much. Hope this is helpful for you. We've included our usual contacts, first for special education, and then also for our federal programs folks, and some information from Lisa, myself, and Austin. So thank you all so much for everything you do. We hope that you are able to enjoy this beautiful, unseasonable weather that we're going to have the next few days. And as always, folks, stay super. Thank you for your time and have a great day.